broadcast for shooters, hunters, and gun enthusiasts. This is the Firearms Radio Network. This edition of Gun Guy Radio is supplied by Alien Gear Holsters. AlienGearHolsters.com.
Welcome to episode 155 of Gun Guy Radio. This is a podcast that shines a positive light on the firearms lifestyle. I'm your host, Jake Challand, and this is your weekly dose of positive firearms talk without the politics. It's my pleasure to introduce to you your guest host, Ryan Machad of Handgun Radio. And I'm going to start a little countdown thingy here every week to my personal Independence Day. So only 20 weeks left of my dreaded day job. I'm looking forward to freedom. Ryan, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Jake. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gun Guy Radio. I'm Ryan Machad from Handgun Radio, and I'm really excited to be able to host the show for a while, and I really look forward to addressing some of the topics and speaking to some people that may not have worked on Handgun Radio. So I hope to have the listener learn something new every show, and that's always been my goal. No matter how much knowledge I have, there's always something new to learn. So a little bit about myself. I'm a huge history buff, as you'll probably see in this episode, and I really enjoy the classic firearms, the military firearms, and the other guns that just aren't quite the norm in today's gun world. So, for example, I just recently got the chance to meet up with the owner of one of my very favorite YouTube channels, Forgotten Weapons. Ian is a great guy, and we both share very common interests for weird, exotic, and forgotten firearms. Ian was up here in Maine doing some video work at the James D. Julia Auction House, roughly 5 miles from where I live, and we got to meet up for lunch, and one of the coolest things was I got to hold a Colt single-action Army cylinder that Elmer Keith blew up when he was testing 45 Colt loads in 1924. So it was a great opportunity to be able to hold a piece of firearms history. I'm really grateful and very thankful to Ian for making that happen. So be sure to check out all the videos that Ian will be doing for the James Julia auction here coming up over at ForgottenWeapons.com and Full30.com. Now, speaking of Ian's channel, he also collaborates with his friend Carl on a Full 30 channel called In Range TV. Now, Carl and Ian decided a while back they wanted to make a firearms-related TV show that didn't have all the drama and the other craziness associated with the reality TV shows, and honestly, I think they have succeeded really, really well. They originally started on YouTube, but have now joined Full30.com, which is a video hosting site tailored specifically to firearms content. So far, they've produced a handful of episodes, which have included testing exploding ammunition from World War II, doing 2-gun matches with strange or exotic firearms to see how they match up, and then doing reliability tests of popular firearms to see how they function under adverse conditions. So Carl is also quite a history buff like me, and he has a great interest in the Eastern Front of World War II. I asked him to join me to discuss the firearms of the World War II Eastern Front on both sides and how they may have stacked up against one another. So hopefully you'll find the discussion interesting, and maybe you'll learn something new that you didn't know before. So with that, we'll head into the main topic, World War II weapons of the Eastern Front.
Do you shop on Amazon? How about your spouse? Does your mom? Does your company? Why not use the Firearms Radio Network's Amazon affiliate link next time you shop Amazon? Bookmark firearmsradio.tv/Amazon or click through the Amazon link in the right-hand corner of firearmsradio.tv. Get it? Got it? Amazon it!
So we're into the main topic. I'm joined by Carl from In Range TV, and you also may know him from some of the stuff that Ian does over at Forgotten Weapons. So, Carl, really appreciate you coming on the show to discuss this topic.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So, Carl has quite a bit of expertise in World War II history, particularly the Eastern Front. And today we're going to discuss some of the guns that were used on the Eastern Front of World War II. So I've kind of set them up into a versus fashion, so we can maybe talk about the pros and cons of each firearm versus its counterpart. So before we get started on the different categories here, Carl, how did the Eastern Front combat and thus the firearms usage and other requirements differ from the Western Front?
Well, I mean, obviously the Western Front had phases, right? When you're talking about the very beginning of the war in '39 and such, so the tactics that the Germans were employing, not even necessarily their weapons, but their tactics are what was the overwhelming superiority they had. They really were thinking about the next war. So often you look at history, and people trained for the war they had last, right? So if you're looking at the marginal line, for example, that was a World War I concept, this idea that you're going to have this reinforced barricade that will stop the enemy from getting through, and frankly, the Germans just ran around it, right? So in the beginning part of the war, I don't know that the weapons differed that much in terms of it was the tactics that made the difference. But then later in the war, when you start dealing with a bogged down central forces or Axis forces, the Western Front was different in terms of tactics of the enemy, right? So we see this in movies all the time, and you see the Russians with their human wave attacks, and frankly, they're treating a lot of their soldiers as expendable. You didn't see that as much on the Western Front. So the combat was different in that regard, but then also what really made the difference, and we've heard this about Napoleon, but also in World War II, the extreme cold and the extreme climate conditions and the mud, I think, really differentiates the two in a dramatic way.
Well, what wasn't it? Hitler had sort of crippled himself by opening himself up to both fronts rather than focusing on one.
Well, yeah, but that's a German strategy that goes back to even World War I. They really, I think, personally, studying this topic, the Western Front was only opened up so that they could defend themselves against other Allied forces because their intentions all along was to attack the East. Okay. And so if you look at World War I, this concept of going through Belgium and then into France to open up the West so that you can attack the East was to give yourself a buffer. And they didn't feel that if they attacked the East and, the Russians being allied with other countries, say France or England or whomever, didn't give themselves that Western buffer, they would have been immediately fighting on their own turf. So this was in World War I, you see this, and sort of a recurrence of it in World War II, where the Western Front was to open up the door to try and kick in the Eastern door.
Yeah, so they basically would be able to kind of retreat into France and stuff if stuff happened in their own
if they had to,
territory.
right? Obviously, if you're going to defend your homeland or your borders, you don't want to defend your border. You want to defend further away from the homeland. And so, I'm not saying that was the only motivation for that, but that was a significant tactical decision that was made, which was to quell the Western Front for the Eastern Front assault, which when you see it, that's exactly what happened, right? In '39, they go through the Western Front, take over everything in France that isn't Vichy France, and then at that point, a little bit later, here comes the assault on the Eastern Front, which was always the goal. Because the Lebensraum, which is the concept of living space, where they believed that they needed to go east into the Ukrainian fields where there was grain and resources, and make essentially a rural community there. That was one of the goals, and then also, of course, the fuel and resources that were on that part of the world. That was all part of that Lebensraum concept, which goes right back to Hitler wrote that in his book, Mein Kampf. It wasn't really that. The fact that the world was surprised by that is proof that people aren't paying attention, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
So moving into the weapons here, now we're talking about small arms, but we all have to remember that, aside from maybe the heavy machine guns and stuff like that, battles were won and lost with artillery. Would you say that's maybe a proper statement? It was never like no battle was decided on the use of the handgun or the submachine gun.
Except in situations in which the disparity between the quality of the arms is so significant that, no, I would agree with you. Probably not. Those are generally not the deciding factor for the loss or victory of a battle. They're force multipliers, and they can make a smaller division, say, for example, more capable than a larger one. So, for instances where you start getting towards the end of the war and you have Germans that are armed with the STG-44 versus even the M1 Garand, for that matter, a smaller number of troops can present themselves in a more significant way than a larger opposition force, right. But they in themselves do not win the war. So in terms of winning battles, I would agree artillery is what wins the battle, but what wins the war isn't either of those. It's material and resources.
Right. So we'll start off with the handgun category here, and we'll kind of tackle them sort of similarly. So like you have the Luger P08, obviously, but up at this point in the war, later in the war, that was kind of coming out of favor for the Walther P38, correct?
Well, yeah, the P38 was designed as a modernization project. It's also to reduce the cost. The P08 Luger was an example of old world machining in which the guns were really hand-fitted and lovingly assembled to function. And if you've ever fired one or dealt with them, they are very tight tolerance guns. They're, in my opinion, quite accurate. I find them quite ergonomic and friendly to shoot, actually. And the one I have is very reliable with the right ammunition. However, they do tend to be susceptible to dirt and filth, which of course is not something you want in a combat handgun. So two things. It was to increase reliability but reduce cost, and that's where the P38 came in.
And now the P38 was later in the war, you would think, because I've heard that they used, even though the Luger P08 was like sort of replaced by the P38, people were still using them well up until the end of the war, and maybe even a little bit beyond.
Well, the Germans used every firearm they seemed to get their hands on. They were never capable of keeping up with the material demands of the war. So while the P08 and the P38 were official handguns of the German forces, you'll see them with Czechoslovakian guns, high powers, Norwegian 1911s. They used everything, which later, at the end of the war in 44-45 became a huge problem in terms of ammunition and resupply. But you're right. Those were the official weapons of the Germans, but they kind of used everything.
So on the Russian side, since we're just talking about the Eastern Front, or the Soviet side, rather, you have the infamous and also famous Nagant M1895 revolver, the gas seal gun, or the was it the TT30 at first, and then the TT33, the updated
development cycle, exactly.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So now there you see a little bit more of a disparity because you have a revolver in a fairly anemic caliber, 7.62 by 38 millimeter rimmed. And then you have a fairly modern semi-automatic pistol with some fairly modern features like a removable trigger pack, and that whole firing unit could just be taken right out of the gun. And taking some design cues from like the Colt 1903 and the 1911 and a few other Western designs, but the TT33 in 7.62 by 2.5, which we sometimes know as 7.62 Tokarev. Now, right there, you see quite a bit of difference as opposed to the Walther P38 and the Luger. Both semi-automatic handguns, both generally pretty nicely made. One a little bit more finicky than the other, but both semi-autos. And the jump from that Nagant to the Tokarev must have just been a huge, huge difference to the average soldier. But most people pretty much stayed with the Nagant, didn't they?
Well, the Nagant they had a lot of them. I mean, They were making them through World War I and World War II, at least for a duration of time. So I've fired all these extensively, and I'll tell you, the P08 is a piece of art. The P38 is really quite modern. It led the way for where handguns were going. The Nagant, in my opinion, it's maybe not useless, but very close to such. We could talk more about that. And the Tokarev, if you were to pick out of these four, frankly, it's the best gun of the bunch. It's light, it's thin, it's easy to carry. It's got a very potent round. It's reliable. It's actually a fantastic pistol.
Yeah, I fired the Yugoslav variant, the 57, so I have a little bit of experience with it. But that cartridge, I feel like the cartridge it's probably like 60% gun and 30% cartridge.
Well, that cartridge, I made this comment on something else we were talking about the other day, on something else I was doing. But, this is when the idea of an intermediate cartridge started becoming more and more a reality, right? So the Germans were developing 8 Kurz, which is a shortened 8mm Mauser, which, famously went into the MKB-42 and the MP-44. And then the Russians really did a lot with 30 Tokarev, or 7.62 by 25, which really, by the way, is nothing more than 30 Mauser, which is a German cartridge with just a little more powder in it. They saw the 30 Mauser and the Broomhandle Mauser in before the war, liked the cartridge, saw the potential of it, added some more power to it. If you want to call it a plus P30 Mauser, I don't know if that's a fair statement because it's not a SAMI thing, but kind of is. And then chambered it in the Tokarev and, of course, in the infamous and very effective PPSH-41 and the PPS-43 submachine gun. So that cartridge out of a fairly long-barreled submachine gun, it's not an assault rifle cartridge. It's not quite an intermediate cartridge, but in terms of power, it's getting close.
It's got pretty phenomenal ballistics, even out of a short pistol barrel, 4 or 5 inches. And seeing it come out of a subgun, I just can't imagine, especially the PPSH with that huge, that high rate of fire.
Oh yeah, no, and that cartridge even now is specifically will go through most soft armor. Right. In the right loading. A lot of the commercial loads are a little underpowered, but with the military load, it punches right through. It's a potent cartridge. It really is that middle ground between. It is a pistol cartridge, but It's somewhere between a pistol cartridge and an intermediate cartridge. And if you can imagine, with the idea of a wave attack where you've got a whole Soviet battalion or division running at you with PPSH-41s with drums firing that cartridge, that's a pretty concerning problem.
That's pretty terrifying.
Yes, it is. Not to mention kicking indoors or going around rooms, especially in urban combat. So, when the Germans were in what is now really where the war changed, Stalingrad, they were there with their with their MP40s and their Kar 98s, and the Russians had a lot of these PPSH-41s and things like that. They really were better equipped for that urban combat.
It's kind of the thing. Everybody thinks that the Germans issued MP40s all over the place, and because you see in Hollywood, every Nazi soldier has an MP40, and most of the time. But it actually was the case on the Soviet side. A lot of people had the submachine guns. Oh, yeah, the Soviets put a lot more emphasis. Interestingly, the Soviets put a lot more emphasis on submachine guns and snipers. The Germans, in fact, at the beginning of the war, really had disbanded their whole sniper program. We can get into that later. But, yeah, the MP40, it's a good submachine gun, and they did have them. But they were typically squad leaders, stormtrooping, things like that. They weren't given in mass to the soldiers, which the PPSH-41 was. There was entire combat groups just with nothing but submachine guns. Right.
Which they got that kind of from the Finns. When the Soviets attacked the Finns and the Finns held them off, the Finns were using the M31 Suomi, which shares a lot with the PPSH-41 in terms of just general external functionality. Of course, the Suomi is in 9mm, but they did incredible things with a lot of submachine guns, and the Russians didn't forget that.
Right. Now, wrapping up the handgun section here, the Nagant. Now, in your opinion, I know they have so many things against them. It's kind of a long list, but the cartridge, which honestly I'm pretty sure you could buy cylinders to shoot 32 ACP out of these guns.
You can.
Okay.
Yeah.
The trigger pull, because in part that's because the double action trigger pull rather than the single action, because it has that mechanical feature of moving the cylinder forward after it advances to the next round to form that gas seal.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say is the worst? The ergonomics, the trigger pull?
There's almost nothing good about the Nagant revolver. You know what? Maybe it looks okay. A lot of them were machined nicely, at least the earlier ones. But I think your biggest problem with that gun would be the actual chambering. The cartridge really, even in the military load, it's very anemic. If you had a bad revolver that had a bad trigger pull, but at least the cartridge was potent, you'd have something, right? I don't think this has much of any of that. It's probably pretty resilient to dirt and filth. I'll give it that, which is all Soviet weapons tend to be. But or I should say Russian, actually. But that Nagant revolver has really very little going for it, I have to say. I to give you a good quality would be they look nice.
They're cheap sometimes.
Well, they are now. I mean, yeah, you can get these things in the surplus market for what, $90, $100, somewhere in that
roughly
realm. No, there's not a lot going on for the listeners that aren't aware of this. So when you mention the gas seal, when you double action pull this or cock the hammer, the entire cylinder slides forward and it forces itself into a cone that extends from the barrel, and then the actual cartridge itself is a long piece of brass where the projectile is within the brass, and the whole thing seals. And the concept was to not lose velocity out of which you would with a normal revolver with the gas cylinder. The escaping. But it really didn't make a big difference in terms of velocity, but what it did do is make a very heavy trigger pull and a very hard-to-use gun.
Yeah, the cartridge sort of looks like a really long wad cutter with the bullet seated well below the top of the case mouth.
And that brass is essential for that gas seal, too. I mean, you can actually reload these cartridges by trimming them down, and so you lose the gas seal, but it makes it easier to reload. And it does give it the one unique quality in that it's a revolver you can actually suppress.
Right.
Which is kind of cool, but not applicable to the war.
Now, the only other thing I've noticed, like when I saw you guys, you and Ian do a 2-gun match, the reload on the Nagant, just, I mean, everybody thinks the single action army has a difficult reload, but this thing, you got to pull the cylinder pin, swing it to the right side, open the loading gate, and use that pin. And to be honest, it doesn't look like it has a real big guide area like the single action army does. You know how you're just moving that one little switch forward and backwards.
Yeah, you're referring to a match that Ian and I shot against one another in which I was using a Colt single-action army with black powder versus him with a Nagant, 1895 Nagant, and for rifles we were using a trapdoor Springfield and a Mosin Nagant. But regardless, you're right. The single-action army is markedly faster to unload and reload. You just open the cylinder, the loading gate, half cock it, and the ejectant rod is very easy to line up and punch those rather large cartridges out. On the Nagant, you're dealing with these fairly small diameter cartridges in a fairly small exit hole on the cylinder, and you're trying to line up this rod. And by the way, there's no mechanical index, and you kind of have to line it up as you're doing it, and then push the rod out and push each one of these cartridges out, and then slowly put them back in. It is glacial. We didn't time that reload against reload, but I'm pretty sure I could fire all 6 rounds out of my single-action army, reload, and do it again before you even reload your Nagant once.
Yeah, I would have to agree there. I was watching that, and I was like, wow, that was insane to see the comparison between the two.
Yeah, people joke about the Nagant revolver as being really the effect, the usefulness of that gun was to be a commissar and shoot your comrades in the back. And I'm not sure that that's false, actually. That's probably some truth to that.
So we kind of touched on the submachine guns, but we'll move in here. So I kind of did the same thing. We've already really talked about the PPSH 41, but we can kind of touch upon that as well. But I included on the German side the MP38/40, which sort of like an updated version there, and then the Mauser 712, which isn't. It's more of a machine pistol than a submachine gun, I would have to say. So was the Mauser used a lot on the Eastern Front, or was that more of like a sort of a specialty weapon that you only saw every so often?
You're talking about the Schnellführer, essentially the fully automatic broom handle.
Yes.
Those were around, but I don't think that those were heavily used. I mean, those guns were a fallback to World War I, and they weren't something that were issued. There were quite a few broom handles that you'll see running around on the Eastern Front, but they were things that guys usually brought with them. They wanted to augment whatever they had, and they were able to get their hands on something. You'll see some automatic and even Schnellführers kind of floating around like that. So I wouldn't call them common. How's that?
Yeah, and I had seen, like you said, the Germans would use anything they could get their hands on, and looking at the list of weapons from World War II, I mean, they even had some of the, didn't Astra make a full auto copy of this? And they had some of those too, it said.
The broom handles, yeah. The Astra did broom handles. The Chinese were really enamored with them too, by the way. The Chinese really embraced the broom handle Mauser. So, but yeah, the Germans, they used everything to get their hands on. When you get to 45 in Berlin, you have Volkssturm running around with like 11 millimeter black powder rifles, for gosh sakes. So, yeah. So
would you say the MP38/40 would probably be the most used one on the Eastern Front? I don't think they've had really much else.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was MP41s as well, which is a wood-stocked, and it's actually a different gun. It's very similar, but that one actually was select fire, unlike the 3840, which is, of course, only full auto. For the Germans, it's funny. You look at this, and in terms of German guns, yes, the 40 would be the most common submachine gun you'd find on the Eastern Front, but it would probably be hard to argue. It wouldn't be hard to argue that you would see just as many, if not more, Germans running around with PPSH 41s that they'd captured.
Yeah, because I noticed they had the habit of picking up anything they could find, and then they'd put a new name on them.
Well, I mean, like let's face this. Your Hans, whatever, sitting in a trench on the Eastern Front. You've got your Kar 98, and there's 700 dead Russians laying on the ground in front of you. You probably would want one of those PPSH 41s.
Right.
I would grab one, right? I mean, it makes sense.
Well, and you're not going to have any shortage of ammunition either.
No, in fact, that's another common thing about the Eastern Front is you'll see the Germans using captured weapons extensively, not so much because of the weapons, but because they had the ammunition. As they overran the Russians in 41 and huge amounts, they were getting incredible stockpiles of Russian ammunition. I think they had more of that in many instances than they had their own.
Well, that, and then as the winter came around, the supply lines had difficulty getting to them, who were so far into the country. I mean, they'd have to use what was lying around.
Yeah, there's accidental stories of resupply, but as well as tanks and just general vehicles trying to move supplies up to what would have been the German front in the east. And as the weather got bad, or in fact, when the weather thawed and the roads turned to completely impassable mud, they were actually using dead bodies across the road like logs to get the cars across parts of the mud.
Wow. So the Russians or the Soviets, I gotta stop saying that. The PPSH-41, like we talked about, shooting the 7.62 Tokarev, and then later on the PPS-42-43 in the same chambering. Now you've shot. I actually saw a video you did with Military Arms Channel with Tim over at Battlefield Vegas, right?
Yeah, that's right. At the SHOT Show, we actually did a collaborative video between Ian, myself, and Tim from Military Arms Channel. We went to Battlefield Vegas, which is a kind of a machine gun tourism space. You can see this on full30.com, and we each picked a gun to shoot and talk about, and I picked the PPSH-41.
Now, you said something, or someone said something curious, and I never actually understood why, but you said something about just before you shot it, you used the stick magazine, and you said something about wonder why they held the magazine.
Well, yeah. So that gun actually, when you had a PPSH-41, you had magazines and drums that were sized to that gun. They weren't as interchangeable as we think about with modern manufacturing. So a stick or drum that came out of your buddy's PPSH-41 may not necessarily work in yours. So one of the ways to try and overcome that problem was to hold the stick mag or the drum and push it forwards. And that angled the cartridge to give it a better chance of getting into the chamber.
All right, I was wondering. I was watching. I was like, "What did they mean by that?"
Yeah, the other thing I talked about on that video is that the Germans, the Finns landed up fighting the Soviets and then later fighting the Germans. But after they had succeeded in pushing off the Soviet threat, they gave a bunch of M31 Suomis to the Germans, and the Germans were running around with those with Suomi drums in them, and they had a number of friendly fire incidents in which a submachine gun in the hands of an enemy or of a soldier running around with a drum in it looked like a Russian, and they would get shot. So they actually modified a bunch of MP38 magazines with different pieces of metal on there to lock up into the Suomi M31 submachine gun so that they could use stick mags instead of the drum and avoid that friendly fire problem.
Now, I did notice that I believe you showed the disassembly of it on the video, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe I saw it elsewhere.
No, actually we didn't in that video. But
is there a pin you punch out on the back and it kind of just tips up the barrel?
Yeah,
tilts down?
Yeah, everyone's familiar with AR-15s, and there's a pin in the front, so you take the rear latch assembly open, and the whole thing just kind of opens up,
right?
And it pivots on that pivot pin, and then the whole bolt, spring, and buffer just comes out as an assembly. It's very simple.
Now, the difference between the PPSH-41 and then the later PPS-43, just to looking at them, would be the extensive use of sheet metal stampings and it basically trying to make the product more or less expensive rather to produce.
Cheaper, lighter, easier to manufacture. Exactly. That was the whole purpose of the 42, 43. It also decreased the rate of fire. The 41 has a fairly high rate of fire of around 1,000 rounds a minute, which is great for hosing down things in a room, but also great for running out of ammo quickly. And the 43 is a much more reasonable rate of fire in the 600, 650, 700 realm.
Now, did they just change the spring weight and the bolt weight?
Yeah, bolt weight, spring weight, that's what does that.
Okay.
And travel, of course, the distance of travel, depending on a submachine gun. Any open bolt gun, the weight of the bolt, the weight of the spring, and then the distance that the bolt travels in the receiver all correlate to your rate of fire.
Okay. Now, if you were to pick between the four we have listed, we'll exclude the Mauser 712. If you want to throw the Suomi in there, go ahead. If you had to pick out of that list, which one would you pick if you were in that situation?
As long as I could get mags and drums that matched and were reliable in the gun, I would take the 41. Okay. The ballistic capability of the cartridge, the drum having a capacity advantage. It's a little bit of a heavy gun, but in terms of doing what a submachine gun needs to do, it does it. Now, the 43 would be a hard one to argue against. It's light, it's handy, it's quite modern actually. I've shot one not that long ago, and it's a nice gun. But I personally actually own a submachine gun, and I have different rates of fire with different bolts, and I actually kind of prefer the higher rate of fire. Now, that doesn't give you the same suppression capability of a 600 round per minute gun, and that's the reason you see some of this stuff at 600. You can kind of hose a hill or hose an area and have a rate of fire that keeps people's heads down but doesn't run you dry in seconds. But I'll tell you, when you fire 1,000 rounds a minute, frankly around 800 is just optimal. You can do these bursts and keep everything on target, and I think the 41 works well for that.
Yeah, well, not only that, but the PPS being all that sheet metal and stuff, I can imagine in that cold winter that metal wouldn't be very comfortable to be hanging on to without some pretty substantial gloves.
I don't think anything was comfortable in that. Yeah, and that's a whole other thing we could discuss here. Is there's an entire investigation that's gone on with guns on the Eastern Front and lubricants. The Germans went into the war. In fact, they weren't even provided winter gear when they went into the Eastern Front because it was going to be over before winter came, and of course it was not. And there's essentially notifications from the high command telling the soldiers how to wrap their feet in newspapers and how to insulate themselves with just ersatz equipment laying around because they weren't prepared for a winter war. And in one way they weren't prepared was in the lubricants they were using on their guns. And there's stories about even Kar 98s frozen and the bolts locked shut on the Eastern Front where they couldn't even open or run the actions. And the Russians, of course, are more ready for that. Their guns tended to have a little bit bigger tolerances, not as accurate, but better tolerances. And they did creative things like mix their gun lubricant with half diesel to make it thinner. Or they even used sunflower oil in southern Russia on their guns, believe it or not, as a lubricant. So things might run sluggish, but they ran. And so a gun that's frozen shut versus a gun that runs sluggish is which one would you rather have?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's something like up here where I am in Maine. I know last night it was 5 below, and we had snow falling down. And people don't consider the lubricant, how it will change depending upon the climate. I've seen people with guns with WD-40 in them, and it's like, yeah, well, when it gets cold, that turns into almost like a gel.
Yeah, on the same note, here I live in Arizona, and we see people out here sometimes using this white lithium grease. I hate that stuff, by the way, but even on modern guns, they put that on the gun, and things here, of course, dry out real fast. That white lithium grease turns into almost an adhesive. It turns into like a glue, and if you do that in the wrong place, like the firing pin channel, you can actually get out of batteries and stuff because the firing pin gets stuck. That stuff is dependent. Your lubrication is completely dependent on your environment. An auxiliary store, I know we're talking about the Eastern Front, but everyone sees M1 Garands with grease on the rails, right? Well, you don't need grease in an M1 Garand. The reason that you can use oil, but the reason grease was used was because it was less likely to run off in rain and water.
Right.
Alien Gear Holsters, the most comfortable and concealable holsters on the planet, is offering big savings with our new 2-holster combo. Now you can buy 2 complete holsters for as little as $49.88. Choose from any available holster styles and colors for the guns of your choice. All of Alien Gear's quality products are made right here in the USA and include a 30-day trial, forever warranty, and free shell trades for life. Visit aliengearholsters.com today.
That's all.
So actually, that's a pretty good segue into the rifles. So this category, again, sort of divided them up here. There's a few more than the other one, but we have the Mosin-Nagant M9130 and then the Mosin-Nagant 1938-1944. And the only difference there between those two is the length of the barrel. The 38-44 is a carbine, and the 9130 is the full-length rifle. And then on the German side, you have the Mauser M98K, the Gewehr 41, and the Gewehr 43. Mm-hmm. And so you had added, I actually asked you a question. I said, I didn't know if the Gewehr 43 or 41 was used in limited numbers on the Eastern Front, but you actually said that was used pretty heavily there.
Yeah, they were. So the 43 is really an improved 41, and we can get into that in a minute. But yeah, if you read, for example, Sniper on the Eastern Front, which is an excellent book I've referenced in some of our videos on InRange, it was the memoirs of Sepp Allerberger, and he used a G43 there, and they were designed originally. The G43 was going to be a semi-automatic sniper rifle. It didn't quite meet the expectations in terms of accuracy for some of the guys that expect that of a sniper rifle, but it was used very heavily in a semi-automatic role and was actually a fairly reliable design. But and many books that you read on the Eastern Front, those G43s show up as the one German real semi-automatic rifle. Besides, of course, heavy dependency on captured Russian SVT-40s, which we didn't put on the list here, and those were used quite a bit too. The G43 is interesting to look at from a mechanical analysis because when the Germans designed it, they based the gas system. They were trying to improve it on the SVT-40, which is the Russian semi-automatic rifle. And what they did is the SVT-40 has a gas setting on it. You can actually, like a modern gun, there's a little wrench and you can turn the knob and change the gas setting for your lot of ammo or your climactic conditions. But I have found when using a number of SVT-40s, there is no right gas setting. You set it, it's either too little or too much. It's just there's nothing quite right. It's weird. And so what the Germans did when they did the G43 is they just took the concept completely ditched the adjustable gas setting and made it completely overgassed. It is heavily overgassed. And the idea behind that was on the cold, frozen, dirty Eastern Front, overgassing the gun would make it more reliable. And maybe it did in those environments, but if you use one of those guns today, you will actually blow the gun apart if you shoot it without restricting that gas system. It will eventually crack metal parts and bend the rear of the receiver. There's some indication to show that the Germans really realized they had overgassed it too much, because in late 44, 45, early 45, they started drilling holes in the side of the gas cylinder, which was a gas relief valve to try and down the amount of gas being fed into the gun.
Okay. Now, the 41 didn't... I remember reading somewhere that it used some sort of a gas trap system, and they altered the gas system for the 43.
Actually, it's called the Bang system, and if you're familiar with the very, very early Garands, it would use the gas trap system as well. And what it was is when the G41, there was a request for a semi-automatic rifle in the command. One of the requirements was to not drill a gas port. Okay. The idea was that it was going to harm accuracy and reduce the lifespan of the barrels. So two different companies, Mauser and Walther, came up with two different designs, the G41M and the G41W, and there's a cylinder that goes around the barrel, and then there's a portion right in front of the muzzle that is really a cone, and as the gas goes into that cylinder, it forces the gas around the barrel down to the sides of the barrel and strikes upon what you could call as a piston. It's like a puck that sits around the barrel, and that puck then slides back on the barrel, using it as a guide rod, if you want to call it, for lack of a better term, which then impinges on the op rod that then strikes the bolt. The problem with that is it also pushes carbon fouling into the system, and that puck or piston will eventually seize. And so the G41M and W both required extensive maintenance to keep using them reliably. And that was where they ran into a lot of problems, and a lot of the troops kind of gave up on them because they got sick of them not cycling properly.
And so the switch over to that gas port and the G43 made it much more reliable. Yeah,
someone realized that the requirement for lack of a gas port was dumb, and they went ahead and did the G43. The G43 system, the locking system, which is something called a flapping lock system. I don't know how much you want to get into this on this discussion, but it uses a very unique flaps that lock with a wedge, kind of like almost a precursor to a roller lock system, but with flaps. They kept the same thing. In fact, many of the parts from the 41 to the 43 are completely interchangeable, with the exception of the gas system, which is where they changed the gun.
Now, did anybody else ever use that system, the flap locking system?
Yeah. Actually, I believe the DP-28 light machine gun, which we're going to talk about later, uses a flapping system. Let me make sure about that.
So between the two, we'll stick with the semi-autos and we'll go to the bolt actions. Between those two, G43 or the SVT-40, which do you think was probably the better weapon?
Better is an interesting subjective term, right? The SVT-40 was made in more mass and it's more reliable in terms of not shooting itself apart. However, the G43, and I've shot both extensively. I own a G43. I frankly think the G43 is a nicer gun to shoot. I found the G43 to be more accurate. I found the G43 to be more pleasant to fire, and as long as you can deal with making sure that the gun doesn't destroy itself under fire, being either due to the climate or reducing the gas system, I think the G43 is a nicer rifle. The SVT-40, of course, made in larger numbers. So better is an interesting... You know what? The G43 is also shorter. It's easier to kind of walk around and deal with. The SVT-40 is kind of a beast. It's a pike of a gun.
Yeah,
and
I held one at Julia's, and it was pretty hefty, to be honest with you.
Right, yeah, no, it is. And, the SVT-40 was also, they were attempting to turn that into a sniper as well. And I would argue the G43 is actually more effective in that role. The SVT-40, they found it to have an interesting wandering zero problem with the first round fired. So when you fired the first round, your zero was not correct. Subsequent rounds would actually kind of zone in and then be where the zero on the scope was. You can imagine if you're either a designated marksman or a sniper, that first round's kind of important, and so they ditched the concept of it being a sniper rifle and completely stopped cutting scope rails into them at some point, so they just went to straight irons. The G43, however, I believe all of them. There might be some that weren't, but the grand majority, were manufactured with a integral scope rail, and not all of them were issued with scopes by far, but they certainly had a much larger number that were, and I think they were more effective in that role.
Well, in that scope rail, I mean, I've seen that in using the scope that they issued with it, or some of them had issued with it. It looks to be an awfully modern and convenient way of mounting a scope.
Oh yeah, if anyone's familiar with how scopes mount on modern Russian guns like AKs and such, this is very much the same mindset. It's on the right side of the receiver. There's a mount that has in fact, the mount's nearly identical to the current Russian mount. It slides on the rail. You lock a little lever down, and boom, you're done. Right. And you can take it right off too. You unlock that little lever and pull it off, and you could put it in a carry case or whatever. It is very modern. It definitely led the way. And I don't think it's the first guns that did that, but they definitely were the first ones to use it in large amounts. And the current Soviet or Russian designs still use it.
Now the bolt action rifles, the Mauser M98K, that was the final variation of the Mauser M98 rifles, right?
Well, I mean, some countries still continued with the idea. For example, the Yugoslavians made the M48, which is pretty much a K98 with just some slight changes. So the K98 didn't die in World War II. It was used. Some countries still were dealing with them after the war, but it was kind of the end of the design cycle.
Now, in the Russians, why did they go to a carbine? That's kind of a stupid question, honestly, thinking about the length of the 9130, because that is quite a long rifle. But what was that really the impetus of the?
I think it's as simply. I think the obvious answer is as simple as that. It was smaller. It was just shorter. That the 9130 is very. If you're in urban combat, running around with that pike is a problem.
Right, and then put a bayonet on it and makes it even longer.
Right, and of course the 44 had an integral bayonet that would just lock in. The 38 actually didn't have a bayonet at all.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I have a 44 myself, and it's a nice rifle. It certainly lets you know when you pull the trigger that you're firing a full-size battle rifle cartridge out of a carbine.
Yeah, it's a flamethrower, no doubt about it. They're impressive. Even if you don't hit somebody, you'll make them blind and deaf. On the note of the Kar 98, one more thing on that. It's interesting to note this, that like I said, the Yugoslavians were making the M48 after the war, and they were also taking the Israelis and the Yugoslavians were taking what were German Nazi Kar 98s and using them. The Israelis rechambered them in 308 and used them at the beginning of their, the birth of their country again, and you can find quite a few of those. And then the Yugoslavians refurbished Kar 98s, and I can't pronounce the Yugoslavian word. It's like Produce or something like that, 44. It's essentially exactly a Kar 98 refurbished by the Yugoslavians. And I actually have a K98 here that has it's full of Waffen-Ops, and it's a German gun that's been refurbed by the Yugoslavians. And then some of them even mounted a very similar to a high turret scope mount on the receiver and put a M76 sniper rifle scope on it, and they used them in the Yugoslavian Civil War as sniper rifles still. So the K98, you're not going to see the end of those in the world for a long time.
Oh wow! Yeah, no.
Yeah.
And so, looking at the two rifles, obviously there's a quality difference. The Mauser, in most regards, being a much higher quality rifle. Earlier on, maybe not so much the last ditch stuff at the end of the war. What would you go with if you were on the Eastern Front, the Nagant or the Mauser?
Oh, well, notwithstanding the lubrication issue. So let's exclude that, because that's an unfair problem, right? You have a gun that works, you're always going to take that. But let's say the lubrication problem was resolved, which the Germans did resolve it later in the war. I would go with the Mauser within a heartbeat. I'm not a huge Nagant fan. The Nagant serves its role. It does work, but the Mauser is a far better rifle.
Yeah, the Nagant, I mean, I've had situations, and I'm not even in this crazy Eastern Front situation where I've had the bolt to get sticky with various types of ammunition.
Yeah, there's always this argument about, well, your chamber wasn't clean enough, or you're using ammo that was lacquered, and la 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 la. I don't know. The reality is I've seen way too many Nagants with way too many types of ammo from people that knew what they were doing have that problem, where the bolt just gets stuck, and you're sitting there hitting the thing open with a rock. And frankly, they're just utilitarian. They don't have the quality, and some of them are accurate, some of them are not. I happen to have a 1891 30 PU sniper, and that gun shoots great. Frankly, it proved to me that a Nagant can be an excellent rifle when machined properly, but the majority of them were pretty rough.
Right. I mean, I noticed my 44, people here talk about the bayonet issue with it shooting to the left, and I found it to be true myself.
Yeah, that's something we want to do with InRange. We've never done this. The whole lore about the is it zeroed with a bayonet, without a bayonet? That's a video we're going to do in the future, because I'm not so sure on that one, one way or the other.
I'm looking forward to seeing that, because I don't know, maybe it could just be me. I'll be interested to see what you guys come up with.
Yeah, no, it's something on the list. We have a long list of stuff we're going to do, and that's one of them. So
we'll kind of move into the machine guns here, and I honestly don't really know that much about these. So, Carl, I'm probably just going to let you go. Obviously, I know the MG34 and the MG42, the 42 being the buzzsaw. What is it, like 1,200 rounds per minute?
Yeah, or even higher.
Yeah. So then you have the other ones, the DP27 and the DSHK. So the DSHK is more of a heavy machine gun, right?
Yeah. Think of that as the Soviet 50 cal.
Okay, so
yeah.
We'll start with the German ones, the 34 and the 42. So what are the differences between those two?
Well, the 34 is a really nicely machined gun. It's it's mostly milled parts, high quality of manufacture, expensive to make, precision gun. The MG42 was where the German machine gun moved into stamped parts. So they wanted again. You'll see the same pattern over and over and over again, right? You'll see this desire to make more of at cheaper costs, and the Germans were always fighting a problem of supply and resources, and so everything they could do to reduce the overhead in terms of manufacturing weapons, they did it or tried. And the MG42 is an example of that. Now, they made an excellent machine gun. The MG42 is fantastic. The rate of fire, I think, worked against them. But those are the main differences. The 34 is the quality of machining, the milling, the manufacture time, and the 42s, think of it as a stamped gun.
Now, did the 34 have the quick change barrel feature like the 42 had? Okay.
Yeah. No, they both had the ability to change barrels. I think the 42 is a little smoother, but yeah, they both had that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the 42, you just open up that side panel and just basically pull the barrel out to the side and put your new one in.
You push forward on a lever, pull out to the side, and the thing just practically falls out. Just slam another one in there and close it.
And you would be surprised about, didn't a lot of machine guns of that time maybe not have that feature?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's correct. Some of them didn't, and that's, of course, a problem, depending on sustained rate of fire. Now, remember the Germans, an example of, well, I would not call it a machine gun, but we would have, I guess, a BAR, which was used as a support machine gun, a light machine gun. That didn't have a quick change barrel. In fact, it was an armorer job to remove the barrel on a BAR. But the Germans' strategies were highly dependent on machine guns. The riflemen were nothing more than to support the machine gun. So for them to have done a lot of machine gun development makes complete sense, and that's why you see such high-end, excellent machine guns like the 34 and the 42.
Now, would you say that the Soviets put more emphasis on, whereas the machine guns were the main thing and supported by the riflemen, the Soviets sort of, I don't know, I don't really see as much use of the machine guns on their end, more of them focusing on, like you said, the wave attacks with the submachine guns.
Yep, and a huge sniper program. Like I mentioned that earlier, their sniper program was excellent. It actually started, I know we're on machine guns right now, but the Russian sniper program was actually started by the Germans, ironically, and they collaborated with the Germans on their sniper program. And then the Germans were like, we don't need snipers anymore, that's over with. And the Russians kept going with it, and their snipers caused a heavy toll. So, I mean, when you think of a human wave attack with submachine guns and you see snipers out there, and, when we think of snipers now, we think of snipers crawling in the dirt for 5 days and hiding and getting that one shot. And that happened in World War II, but a lot of the sniper in war on the Eastern Front was more of a designated marksman, where they were, instead of a machine gun, imagine precisely aimed fire supporting a charge or a retreat, which, by the way, if you want to go to modern times, that's why you see things like the SVD Dragunov. That's exactly what it's designed for.
Right. So the Soviets, the Degtyarev, I think I'm pronouncing that right, DP-2728 light machine gun, that was shooting the 7.62 by 5.4R, and that was one that had the Pan magazine on the top, right?
Yep, looks like a big old pizza pie. Exactly right. Mm-hmm.
And then, like you said, the DSHK in more of their 50 cal, was that in the battle rifle cartridge, or was that a larger, like a 12.7 millimeter? No,
the DSHK, like I said, was like a 50 cal. You're thinking of it's 12.7 by 108 millimeter. So, like that was like their 50 cal.
Okay.
Like I said earlier.
Now, was that really heavily used in World War II?
I don't want to talk about that too much. I'm not sure. If you're not sure, you don't say anything because you don't want to be wrong. I don't know how much of it was heavily used or not on the Eastern Front, so I'm going to leave that one alone.
So more like the Maxim guns and the DP-27.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you see 1910s and all that stuff rolling around. In fact, I know it's just a movie, but, the infamous enemy at the gates, and they roll up that Maxim behind people. I mean, Maxims are heavily used.
Yeah, with the big shield on the front.
Yep, an armor shield, exactly. Which, by the way, does stop bullets.
So going between the two, either the MG32 or 42 or 34, or the Deg TRF or the 1910 Maxim, what do you think you would go with? Probably the 42 for portability purposes?
No, 34 actually.
34?
Yeah, the 34 is a nicer gun than the 42, and the rate of fire of the 42 really works against its goals. It's the 42's rate of fire, while it has a psychological advantage, it consumes resources at such a high rate and burns barrels at such a high rate that it's the 34 you can keep running longer and better and not burn up all of your ammunition in seconds.
Now, did either one of those guns have provisions for mounting, like, I don't know, maybe like a small drum on the side for having...
Yeah, oh, absolutely. The 34 there's a lot of, you can see single or double drum 34s, for example. The one thing that is neat is if you've ever had the opportunity to fire like a 42, for example, from a tripod mount, they had these mounts that you could put on the ground, and you put the 42 onto it, and the 42 would sit above the trench line, and there's an optic that sits to the left of that on the mount, and you can actually be below the ground level looking through the optic, which is zeroed to the gun or calibrated, and you can actually move and shift the angle where you're aiming at, or the beat zone, by elevation and windage, by just moving these little portions of controls on the tripod. And then there's a lever you switch, or you pull it to push. You push it forward, and it fires the gun. You can fire that completely not exposed. It's kind of impressive.
So it's using sort of a prismatic sight.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The primary glass that's essentially in line with the rifle, with the machine gun itself, then comes down, and there's a prism that brings it to your eye. So you're laying down behind this tripod, looking downrange, but you're not exposed.
That is awesome. Now, the last few here, you have the we've kind of gone on from the machine guns. The PTR S41. Now, I don't know if you know as much about that, or if I do. People will look at this and think SKS.
Sorry, I'm muted. Well, you know, that was intended to be an anti-tank rifle.
Okay.
It's along the lines of that. Let's put it that way. None of these I'm sorry about the dog. I apologize. I am at home. These anti-tank guns were not very effective on any tanks very, very long into the war, but they were still used, and the Russians definitely did try to use them. You know, if you could get a clever shot into the right location on a piece of armor, or maybe on an armored vehicle, you could have some effect with them. But they were, I think, frankly, trying to use a lot of these anti-tank guns against a tank was more dangerous to you than it was the tank.
Right, and I mean, It wasn't like I believe it was the Japanese armor that wasn't very thick on their tanks, and it wasn't like the Pacific Theater where you had that. You know, I mean, the German and the Russian tanks were quite hefty.
Oh, they're behemoths. I mean, the T-34 and the Tiger, or the Panzer IV. These things were. I mean, you look at the American Sherman, and they look small when you compare them to the German equivalents. The German tanks were moving battleships. I mean, if you want to get into the craziness the Germans are getting with this at the end of the war, they had, I think, one or two of the Maus. This thing is a land battleship. It's ridiculous. It couldn't move for anything, but it was immense. And Hitler, in particular, had an obsession with making tanks larger and larger and larger. These anti-tank guns were kind of a joke.
Now, is there anything we've missed that that was really used on the Eastern Front a lot that we haven't talked about?
Well, I don't know that it was used a lot, but I think it's worth bringing up to the audience. So everyone's familiar with, we did not get to we briefly touched upon the SDG-44, the MP-44, which was, of course, the world's first assault rifle.
Yeah, I can't believe I didn't include that on here.
No. And that's but no, let's do that. So the Germans were experimenting with the idea of a intermediate cartridge, or 8 Kurz, before the MP-44. I mean, in 1940 even they were talking about that, and they had come up with the idea that these full length rifle cartridges are unnecessary for the where we're firing at. A submachine gun in 9mm isn't quite reaching out far enough, and the battle cartridges are these full length cartridges are reaching too far. So they decided to do the intermediate cartridge, which was 8 Kurz, which, by the way, a running joke on In Range between Ian and I is that 300 Blackout is 8 Kurz. Ballistically, they're the same. That's another conversation. But that's where that came from. And so they originally issued something called the MKB-42, and there was a couple of different experiments, but the MKB-42 was the first real sort of successful one. It was, if you can imagine, the STG-44, but with a slightly different gas system, and it fired only from an open bolt. And there's rumor that they supposedly dropped some of these into Stalingrad, and they had some experiments with them there. I don't believe that's the case, but they definitely were experimenting with them on the Eastern Front, the MKB-42, and they liked them, but they didn't like the open bolt. They didn't like the weight, and they didn't want it to be full auto all the time. It's hard to control and get good accurate shots. And so the next development was the MP-44, and the reason it was called the MP-44 was machine and pistol, and it was because Hitler had put a moratorium on the development of any more rifles, and so they called it a machine pistol to get around the bureaucracy.
And then I believe once he saw it, he was very excited.
Exactly right. So they made the MP-44, started giving it to troops, and these guys were, like I said earlier, it doesn't win battles, but it's a force multiplier. And when you were on the Eastern Front as a German, you were well outnumbered, right? So any force multiplier you could get was good, and the MP-44 did that. And there was a meeting with Hitler where they were talking about what to do on the Eastern Front, and he asked one of the I think it was a general. I may be incorrect, but he asked one of the men, "What could I do to help you on the Eastern Front?" And he said, "More of these rifles." And he's like, "What rifles? There's no new rifles." And he's like, "This." And then when he realized what it was good for, that's when he actually gave it the name. Ironically, the name we still use today, assault rifle. He called it the Sturmgewehr, which is storm rifle, and that's where assault rifle came from. And that was quite heavily used on the Eastern Front.
Now, were they used much on the Western Front at all?
Yeah, no, they showed up in both places. But as you can imagine, the Western Front, when you look at the statistics for the German loss in World War II, the number for German casualties, somewhere around 80% of all German losses were the Eastern Front. So if you put that into context, the Western Front, of course, it was a huge battle. It wasn't anything compared to the Eastern Front. So if you could put your best and your most resources anywhere, you put it on the Eastern Front.
Right. Well, I mean, you look at the Soviet casualties. What did they lose? Something like 1.1 million?
Oh, well, more than that.
More than that?
Oh, yeah. Let me look that up real quick. It was I don't remember the exact number, but I'll look it up. The casualty rates were insane.
Yeah, the Soviets definitely had that. You mentioned enemy at the gates. It's just go towards that line and do what you got to do, and maybe not have the right kind of equipment you need. Right.
So let's see here. So the Germans, these numbers are very hard to really pin down, but the German losses, military deaths of the Germans was somewhere around 4.3 to 5.5 million German military deaths we're talking about here, right? Soviets were at around 14 million.
Wow.
That's military, not civilians.
Oh, man.
So when you're talking almost a 3-to-1 ratio of German to Russian death, and that's just soldiers. So yeah, the insane. If you look at overall deaths, including civilians, which becomes more nebulous, Germany was somewhere around 7 to 9 million, and the Soviets were in the 21 to 28 million range.
I guess I need to get back to reading my history books then.
Yeah, I know that this is not a lot of Americans. Nobody should be offended by this, but World War II was really. I mean, obviously the Americans and the Lend-Lease and the Americans D-Day and all that made a huge difference. But the war really was won by the Soviets.
Yeah, it is just insane to even think about that number, especially today. Just to see that it's almost you can't comprehend.
Oh, it's a number you can't get your head wrapped around. 13.8 million people. It's like they're losing countries.
Right. It's just insane.
I know. I mean, I live in Arizona, and Phoenix is like around 4 million people. That's the rough number, 4 million people. So the lowest estimate of military Soviet deaths would have been 2 entire Phoenix cities, if not more. And that's the lowest number. Probably more like 3 or 3.5 Phoenixes. That's
13 of the state of Maine. I think we only have 1.3 million up here.
Right. So I mean, okay, so 13 Maines went away for the Soviets, just military deaths.
That is crazy.
Ballroom jeans, fire hose work pants, and long-tail tees are 3 favorites among the men of Gun Guy Radio. Duluth Trading Company has perfected the art of clothing the manly man. If you want manly comfort that's trusted by these gun guys, go to gunguyradio.com/Duluth and check out the other manly essentials Duluth Trading Company offers gun guys like us.
Yeah.
So, wrapping up the main topic here, Carl, I know you spoke about Full 30, so for the people who don't know, what is Full 30?
Okay, Full 30 is a new content distribution network that is going to be firearms related and firearm friendly in its entirety. So we see a lot of cool gun channels that have existed on YouTube for a long time, and there's great content there, but YouTube, if you don't know this, is really not pro-gun. In fact, tends to be sort of anti-gun. It's owned by Google, and they don't allow firearms-related advertisers, for example. And there's always the fear, we don't know if this will come or not, but that they may someday just decide no more gun-related content on YouTube. So Full 30 is a place where hopefully a lot of the best and most entertaining and most informational gun channels are moving to. So you find stuff like Forgotten Weapons is on there, Military Arms Channel's on there, In Range is on there, which is a project between me and Ian, and many more. We're seeing channels joining every day. And there's a good reason to be there. One, you're not fighting the tide of YouTube and Google, but now we can have ad-related content, which, by the way, Full 30 is free to watch. It's just ad-supported, just like YouTube is for the viewer. But it's ad-related content that hopefully you care about. So it's gun-related content, like Rock Island is advertising on there, and Black Rifle Coffee, amongst others. So that's the goal.
Yeah, we were watching last night. My friend, the Australian, and I were watching. I want to say it was the exploding ammunition test you guys did on In Range with the B Patron.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really interesting. It's nice to see a place where all that content is gathered together and it's not kind of hidden. And also seeing Aguila Ammunition advertising on it. That's an ad that interests me.
Right. No, exactly. First of all, there's more and more advertisers that are knocking on the door. They want to be able to advertise their products, and they should be able to, and they can't. YouTube prevents them. So it makes no sense to have a firearms-related program where your advertisers and your market can't be reached. I just don't get that. So that's why Full 30 is here, and so Aguila's on there. That's another fine example, and I'm sure you're going to see more of that sort of thing. Now that you mentioned the observation ammo for people that are interested in the Eastern Front and World War II, I highly recommend, and I realize this is self-promotion, but it is something you should watch. The in-range TV video on Full 30 about specifically World War II exploding ammunition, which is PZ or Soviet PZ or B Patron. Really, if nothing else, watch that one.
Yeah, that was a really great video. I'll definitely put a link to that in the show notes. So you're doing In Range. That's your project with Ian, doing various things, 2-gun matches, reviews of guns. I think you did the review of the Masterpiece Arms, and then the sort of the copy of the Leader T2.
Yeah, that's correct. So Ian's effort with Forgotten Weapons is really wholly based on historical firearms and esoteric firearms, and I help him with that and do video work and such. But the project that we're doing together is In Range TV, and so we want to merge those worlds. We want to take the modern and the old, put it together, do modern reviews, do references about how modern guns were still influenced by historic guns, maybe how they were used in history, and we even have some segments on there which are firearms related tenuously, like for example some Old West history, which is pretty cool too.
Excellent. So if you want to access that, head over to full30.com. Be sure to sign up and subscribe. You get email alerts every time a new video is posted. Really great content over there. So, Carl, I really want to thank you for taking the time out of your day and actually coming on here to talk with us about World War II Eastern Front firearms.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, and hopefully I brought some interesting information to the conversation and something to maybe the listeners hadn't heard of before. And if you had heard of it, hopefully you liked hearing about it again.
Hey, it's Jake here, just checking in here on Ryan, and I wanted to make sure that you're enjoying this episode of Gun Guy Radio. And if you are, please consider going over to patreon.com/gun. What is Patreon, you may ask? Well, Patreon is a simple way for you to crowdfund every episode of Gun Guy Radio. If you're enjoying the show, you can go over to patreon.com/gun and pledge either $1 an episode or $5 an episode to, throw your support behind Pro Gun Radio like this. And also we have some companies that are throwing their support behind Gun Guy Radio by giving some gift cards and gear to send out in random battle boxes that go out to only our patrons here on Gun Guy Radio. Alien Gear Holsters have given $25 gift cards. Works Holsters have given $25 gift cards. LA Police Gear has given some bags. And Duluth Trading Company has given $50 gift cards. Not to mention Duke Cannon Supply Company has also given Field Box gift packs of big-ass bricks of soap. And GunGoddess.com has also included $25 gift cards. You can get all that and more in a random drawing of our battle boxes that we send out to the exclusive group of patrons of Gun Guy Radio. So walk, don't run over to Patreon. Wait, I said that wrong. Patreon.com/gun.
Gun Guy Radio says thank you and proudly displays artwork and graphics designed by Ryan Cross of Hunter of Design. HunterofDesign.com.
Well, that about wraps it up for this week's episode of Gun Guy Radio. Please remember to subscribe to us on iTunes so that you never miss a show, and please leave us a review there as well, gunguyradio.com/iTunes. Also, please consider joining the NRA and also the Second Amendment Foundation. There are links there in the show notes. And don't forget to check out all the other shows on the Firearms Radio Network. This is Ryan Machad. Thanks for having me, and I'll see you next week.
This has been a production of the Firearms Radio Network. You can find more information at firearmsradio.tv. In a world where the mainstream media only talks about clips and ghost guns, where do you turn for accurate firearms news?
We know people like Ultimac rails, which, as far as I'm concerned, for gas tubes on custom AKs is a standard.
Live every Thursday night at 8 p.m. Central.
The magic of tracking point, I don't think, is the optic per se, because optics don't make you shoot better; they make you see better, right? But the magic of tracking point is that it separates stability from trigger control.
This Week in Guns has been broadcasting the truth for over 100 episodes.
Like, haha, idiot, not, haha, now you don't have a finger.
It's funny when you say it like that.
Yeah, they're both kind of funny.
Featuring the Full Auto News segment. Stories the real media refuses to talk about.
I wonder if there's anybody over there who likes firearms freedom like us.
ThisWeekinGuns.com or search This Week in Guns on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher app.